Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Latifa Farah, Associate Creative Producer at Venture for Canada and the producer of a new wave of entrepreneurship. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and Canadian entrepreneurs to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneur mindset and skills. In Season 5, we'll be chatting with CEOs, founders, and successful business leaders about their career journeys. We're excited to dive into these conversations about how to foster your entrepreneurial mindset and drive.
Allison Loat is the Managing Director of Sustainable Investing and Innovation at OPTrust, a Canadian public pension plan. She leads OPTrust's responsible investment program, its total fund climate change strategy, and a new portfolio investing at the intersection of sustainability and innovation with a focus on climate change. She has a deep commitment to public service. Alison co-founded the Samara Centre for Democracy and was a senior fellow and instructor at the University of Toronto and the president of the Canadian Club of Toronto. Allison, it is a pleasure to chat with you. How are you doing this afternoon?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. I've been really looking forward to this.
I have been as well. And I really enjoyed reading your book over the last month or so called Tragedy in the Commons, which I highly recommend our listeners check out. And for context, the book is kind of compiles the learnings from Allison and her colleagues interviewing approximately 100 former Canadian parliamentarians and learning about their experiences in the inner workings of Canadian democracy. So, Allison, can you tell us a little bit about what were some of the key learnings that you gained from writing this book?
Well, I found this book came out in 2014, so it's been a long time since I've sort of talked in depthly about it. But one of the things to me that was most interesting when you interview people about such an important time in your life, like being a member of parliament, which is obviously a hugely significant role for anyone who's filled it, is that the parts of their recollections that were, at least to me, were the most interesting were not what I thought they would say. So, for example, we started out all of the interviews with just what we thought was a warm-up question. How'd you get into this in the first place? And that was just kind of, I guess, where surprise number one came. So I don't know what I thought people would say, but they all said a version of this. Oh my, I never thought I would be a politician. I never wanted to run for office. I was over here doing my thing, and then so-and-so knocked on my door and asked me to run. And I said no, and then they came back and they came back. So there's versions of this sort of hugely reluctant individual that kind of got dragged kicking and screaming into the political arena. And so on one hand, these are people's truths and this is their memory or how they choose to remember their memory. But what I felt was actually quite sad about that, particularly given, the importance of the role of a parliamentarian in our democracy, is that only one of them said a version of, I thought that politics was a really incredible way to make a contribution to my country. And I had my eyes open for an opportunity. And when it came, I grabbed it. And that shouldn't feel like a super controversial thing to say, but the fact that so few of them recalled their entry to politics that way, I thought was quite sad. As we reflect in the book, as you know, what we sort of provoked out of that is that if you, as the sort of holder of these, keys to the office, aren't, standing up and actually telling a different story about the career that you're in, can you really blame a young person for not wanting to vote or for not seeing politics as a valuable way to contribute? So one of the sort of, again, surprises to me was just how reluctant they were to sort of own the narrative of the profession they've chose. And now I know why, because they are trying to identify with the public who, we don't like politicians. But that's not going to change if MPs themselves don't stand up and articulate the purpose behind the roles that they fill in a more compelling way.
In your book, you go into detail about some of the challenges with Canadian political parties and how they aren't as inclusive as they could be or as representative. What do you think, what is one principal change that you think Canadian political parties should make to their structures?
So, I'd say there's at least probably two big things I would recommend. One is a broad one, which is transparency, greater transparency, shine some sun on this situation. Political parties have a lot of important functions. They choose who runs for office, and that's often done very opaquely. In some ridings, the nomination is actually the election. If you're a Conservative in Alberta, most ridings in Alberta, typically if you win the nomination, you're going to win the general election. So there should be a little transparency in that process. A number of other functions, but another one I'll just mention, this leads to my second suggestion, is their policy role. They are charged with determining the policy and setting the policy direction for the country. This is an area that's hugely under-resourced. Now, our political parties are very publicly subsidized. And again, back to there should be more transparency in exchange for that public subsidy. But very few of them invest heavily in real public policy infrastructure or thinking. There's potentially a model we could look at out of Germany where they do establish policy foundations. And this is a little bit with what we see at the Broadbent Institute and the Manning Center, where they try to establish some separate infrastructure to really drive some policy thinking. But that infrastructure here in Canada is very nascent and very underdeveloped. So I think there's a huge opportunity there as well.
Another area that you discuss a lot within the book is the fact that a lot of members of parliament kind of show up and they don't really necessarily know how to do their jobs. Like they're just kind of elected member of parliament. They come from diverse kind of career paths. Many of them have had no previous kind of experience in politics. And then all of a sudden, they're an MP and they have 100-hour weeks and all of these different kind of things going on. What would you kind of suggest should be done to kind of ease people's transition from being a kind of a citizen to becoming a member of parliament in terms of kind of a formal orientation?
One is about the work that the individual running has to do to think hard about why they're running and what they want to do there while they're there. And then I'll talk about orientation in a minute. One of the things that another surprise was when we asked what we thought was kind of a warm-up question, what did you do as an MP or what was the role of the MP? We got about as many answers as we had MPs we interviewed. And you sort of think about that, like imagine going into a workplace where people who hold, basically the same job have drastically different interpretations of what that job is and what they're meant to do. So one example was, we had one person talk at length about how their role was really to set policy for the country. And, that was their primary purpose. And yeah, they represented a riding and they brought that perspective forward, but that was their job. And then you had other people say, well, all that highfalutin Ottawa stuff, waste of time. I'm here to help, my people in my riding, access services. Those are really different jobs, but they have the same job. So I don't know, what's their job? Maybe it's both, I don't know. But very few actually articulated what the job of the MP was, which is to hold the government to account. So I thought that was also very, very interesting. At least that's what traditionally we would define the role of the MP in the Westminster system. So that goes to orientation. When we did initially write a report, I think it was called, What Am I Here to Do or something. It was about, I forgot, I have to double check the title, but it was really about, I think it was a job with no description or something we called it. And we pointed out that there was no orientation. But the right orientation depends on what the job is, right? So if your job is to be a service professional, a souped up customer service representative and you're riding for the government of Canada, that's a really different training than if your job is to be a policymaker, just to give two examples. And then I also think you need to know the rules of how Parliament works, how agendas are set, what committees do. I mean, there's a whole bunch of technical information on how that organization runs that you should be familiar with. There's also a really important communications role I think elected officials play. So those are just a handful of, the challenges and what would a perfect orientation system look like. The reality is I think the political orientation is one thing. What Parliament would offer would be another. And then I also think there is a role for, call it independent executive education that is at a little bit more of a sort of, strategic and content-based level than they might get from some of the other places. Right now it's spotty, but I think, one of the little legacies of Samara was that I think there has been a bit more attention on the need to provide MPs with the tools to do their jobs well if we expect them to excel.
I think that the work that you did at Samara and the Samara continues to do is something that is so important because we have faced huge problems as a society, and there's probably few things that are a better public investment or better just investment in general as a society as of investing in enhancing our democratic and infrastructure. Because the more that our democracy is strengthened, the more that we have an ability to tackle all of these different problems, be it like climate change, income inequality, economic growth. And when you look at Canadians' trust in public institutions, there's been this steady kind of fall in terms of trust in public institutions and democracy, not just in Canada, but around the world. So I think that your work, it was very interesting from a Canadian perspective, but also globally, when you look at the rise of the decline of democracy in a lot of areas of the world, your work is absolutely critical. So kind of shifting a little bit to your career, you left a prestigious job at McKinsey and Company to launch Samara Canada. Can you tell us a little bit about what motivated you to go launch a charity and leave this very prestigious, sought after job at McKinsey?
Well, McKinsey's I think is a part of the story in a funny way. So when I was started at McKinsey right out of university, about a year in, I sort of had the itch to engage in policy and issues facing the country, and I started working with 5 other friends to set up an organization which was called Canada 25, and our goal there was to find a meaningful and productive way for young Canadians around the world to get involved in public policy. We believed there were a lot that cared, but they lacked a meaningful outlet to get engaged. Back to my comment about political parties earlier, that could be one potential opportunity for them. So I started this off the side of my desk while I was at McKinsey, and it really grew. And we had some incredible people involved. And McKinsey actually gave me a paid leave to set that organization up and run it out of the McKinsey office for ultimately several years. So that was kind of Samara 1.0 in a way, that organization. And some of the alumni include the person who developed the Millennium Development Goals, which led to the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN, the now former mayors of Calgary and Edmonton, just to name a couple. I mean, there were some superb people that have gone on to great acclaim, and there are many more. So that was a really inspiring time for me, where I saw that trying to come creatively at public issues in Canada actually can make a big difference. So I knew that was kind of what I always wanted to dedicate my career to try to do as best I can. So I ended up going to Samara because I had opportunity to meet Michael McMillan, with whom I co-founded the organization. While I was at Canada 25, I tried my darndest to raise some money to keep that organization afloat. I mean, I essentially worked for free for years for that organization. And McKinsey, as I said, provided the office space with no expectation of favor, which is why I'm very, very loyal alumni of that firm to this day. So a lot of CEOs would get up and talk about youth engagement and stuff like this or whatever, and then I'd try to engage them, and it never went anywhere. So when I met Michael, who at that time was just sort of winding up first phase of a very successful career in Canadian media, and he was trying to think about what he could do, sort of to light a bit of a fire under the country. And it was pretty general. And he and I spent a fair amount of time kind of talking and getting to know each other. And then he said, listen, let's get something going. And so for me, it was an opportunity to, be able to build something that I felt would make a meaningful contribution to the country with a little more resourcing than we had at Canada 25. And I just felt it was an opportunity I couldn't turn down. So that was really the reason. And because it was about my heart and where I felt I could make a meaningful contribution. And I've always really enjoyed building things. I've enjoyed working on really tough problems, and it was a privilege to get to do that.
That is really awesome that McKinsey let you basically work on something on the side like that for years, and while paying you and letting you work at the office. It's a pretty remarkable story. So kind of, this is a question that's more specific to like fundraising in the charitable sector and kind of philanthropy in Canada. Do you think that there is like a lack of like philanthropic kind of capital in this country, and that the barriers to kind of like launching new charities or new kind of nonprofit initiatives are kind of too significant?
On the first, the answer is yes. On the second, it's easy to start something. It's hard to grow it and build it. So it's very easy to start something. You set up a website, and it's easier than ever to start something then. It certainly was in Canada 25 days. We had a primitive website. There was no Facebook. I wrote letters to get people involved. Funny little story, by the way, I wrote to the Rhodes Trust because I was like, where are places where they have like lots of, smart Canadians living all over the place? So, and they supported it. And I had like 25 Rhodes Scholars apply, and we only had 20 spots. And I'm like, I can't have them all be Rhodes Scholars, but I also can't turn down Rhodes Scholars. Like, why is this happening? In any case, so yeah, I think there is a dearth of, I'll call it kind of creative philanthropic money in Canada. And I do think, for all the generosity in our companies and governments, those are often tied to very clear agendas. So we definitely don't have a lot of, creative entrepreneurial public service capital, for lack of a better word. And I think that's a huge disappointment.
If we have a listener who, let's say, has similar diverse cross-sector experiences and is kind of looking for their next thing and looking how to position themselves in the job market. What advice would you give this person?
I feel that it's been privileged that I've been able to do so many interesting and different things in different sectors. Like, I've loved it. You can connect dots that you never thought you could. You meet and get to work with so many incredible people that come at the world in such different ways. So I would never sort of discourage anyone from taking, a slightly less direct path of their career. I think it's extraordinary. In a small market like Canada, though, it's definitely challenging. When I was living in Boston for a number of years, as you mentioned, and trying to re-enter the Canadian market was a lot harder than I expected. And a friend once said to me, when things are hard, that's when you're really learning. And I drew on that wisdom many times. But I think, for me, again, you can only do what you can control. So generally my conversations would say, well, we want somebody with 15 to 20 years of progressively senior experience doing X, sales, marketing, whatever the heck it was, investing, communications. So it's a very siloed career expectation. So that was good for me to see. But I had to work hard on, okay, well, what have I done for 15 to 20 years progressively? Right? I've built organizations, I've led teams. Like, I really had to do that hard work. I still had to struggle against, well, you don't have enough content expertise in one thing. So I'm not providing good advice because I'm just relaying my story. And so it was about taking the time to find the organization that was actively looking to hire people with different backgrounds.
By the way, I think that challenge can also exist in the charitable sector. I found different employees of Venture for Canada, when we've been doing hiring and things, there's been this often inclination by some people to be like, oh, we only hire people with charitable sector experience. People from all other sectors, like, their experience doesn't. So it's interesting. I do think that there can be a tendency to sort of silo and say, like, oh, there's not, they worked at this big bank, therefore they cannot work in the charity sector, or like they worked at a startup, their experience doesn't kind of qualify. And so I'd say employers of all sector, like, look at the person just in general and their potential. Don't necessarily look at what narrow industry that they've been in. I think it's great points that you shared, Allison. What's like one kind of tangible piece of advice that you have for people who maybe recently their confidence was shaken by something and they're looking to rebuild it?
I mean, this is an easy thing to say and harder to do, but you've got to sort of lean on a friend. I had an important intervention happen to me when I was having lunch with a friend, and I was just like, I'm just sort of struggling to figure out kind of where the next move for me is. Like, I wasn't like devastated or anything, but just because I had a job in Boston which I enjoyed. So I wasn't unemployed. And she said to me, I want you to come over when you got a few hours because we got to work on some stuff. And she really helped me think hard. Again, this comes back to like, who am I and how do I want to project myself in the world? And she actually tangibly walked through how to approach questions like, tell me about yourself, tell me about your background. Oftentimes people will kind of blab, and she's like, you have to be very intentional. You know what they're looking for. So you start out with just a little story about how you grew up. I grew up, my parents were teachers at a boarding school. I grew up in a boarding school. So I kind of learned that, you give your all to your community and you do what needs to be done. That's my truth. That's true. That was my upbringing. She had her story. And what that, a version like that paints a picture right away. It allows you to connect with somebody, and that tells you a lot about yourself. And then you kind of build from there. So she really, and I mean, I'd mostly created my own job. So I never really had to go through a proper interview process before. That was another problem. So she really helped me work that through. How are you really intentional and strategic about telling your story? And then, what are the main things, they're looking for, and build that in. So if it's...
I'm going to ask a more controversial question that is related to your field. But do you think that Canadian pension plans should divest from natural resource, from like oil sands or certain, significantly carbon emitting projects within the country?
I do not. And I'll tell you why. There's a bunch of different reasons. My own view on this is that the entire global economy needs to transition from one that is based on fossil fuels and high emitting energy sources to one that is much more renewable and sustainable. I think that's unequivocal. So I believe that people who see divestment as the best path and I share the same ultimate objectives. And there's divergences on how to get there. From an investor perspective, one of the biggest challenges is that for us is we want to decarbonize our entire portfolios. So if you divest from oil and gas, that certainly can really help you, but that doesn't help you in any of the other industries, which are also very emitting. So if you look at some of the world's largest emitting sectors, they're things like industrials, steel, cement, right? Should we divest from those? Real estate. Should we divest from real estate? Transportation. Should we divest from transportation? You see where this is going, right? Agriculture. Should we divest from agriculture? So you find yourself, if you sort of say, okay, well, what is my ultimate goal? And then how do I get there? As an investor, I mean, we have to put our money to work for the benefit of our beneficiaries to ensure they have a pension. So that means we have to have something we invest in. So this makes it much more difficult. So we have to, I think about ourselves in the role that we play in ensuring the transition happens, ideally in as smooth and as least disruptive a way as possible. That includes ensuring pricing predictability, which we already are having a huge challenge with. If you live in Europe, right, you see this firsthand. And because we have to have a just transition, right? And we have to ensure that we are not divesting from the industries that are probably best positioned to lead that transition. Now, that doesn't mean every single oil and gas company should be invested in, but it also doesn't mean that they should all be divested from. So that's where it gets a lot more complex. So I think it's really up to investors to have a very clear plan on the role that they play in what I'll call this energy transition, which is really underpinning our entire global economy and nearly every industry in which we invest. And just a pure divestment approach isn't going to get us there as investors. And I'm not saying we, as I said, it's not like every single oil and gas company is acting in the best spirit of that transition, but there are many that are. And if we make it harder for them to do their jobs, then it's going to be a rougher transition for all of us and for every industry. So I know that's not the answer people want to hear, but that's unfortunately the reality of the economy that we have today.
No, and it's a super complicated subject. At Venture for Canada, we recently had Mark Podlasly, who is the Director of Economic Policy. Do you know Mark, Alison? He is great. And he is a director at the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. And he spoke to Venture for Canada fellows, and he was very critical of ESG, so environmental and social governance. And he argues that ESG undermines Indigenous people's interests. And for context of listeners, there's the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, aka UNDRIP. And UNDRIP has specific rule, or which has also received royal assent in Parliament. So UNDRIP is coming to Canada, and it requires free and informed prior consent by Indigenous peoples in terms of development. So there's one standard in terms of UNDRIP of Indigenous consultation. And then there's ESG, so environmental and social governance sort of standards, which are not at the same as UNDRIP kind of standards. And he basically was arguing that we're going to enter into a situation where there's going to be a big conflict between the UNDRIP standards and ESG standards, and that in particular, a lot of corporations use ESG as a way to say, oh, everything's good, but they're not actually getting the consent of Indigenous people. So my question to you, Alison, is do you think that there are significant issues with ESG standards in that, yes, they might be environmental, they might align with environmental interests, but at the same time, there's a challenge because ESG standards aren't often sufficient in terms of Indigenous engagement?
So there's a bunch of things there. So I'll speak first about ESG standards, and then I'm going to talk about the Indigenous angle. And I'm fortunate to know Mark, and I know his work, and he's it's a massively important contribution that he's made to this discussion, in my opinion. So for ESG standards, unfortunately or fortunately, there are no ESG standards. And this is part of the challenge. Now, there is a movement, and there was an announcement this week that the standard setting bodies, of which there are many with competing standards, are working together to align around one set of standards that would be akin to accounting standards, right? So when you say carbon has a standard, so I'll pick another one. Frankly, I don't know what they're going to be, but let's say diversity. We're going to have some defined metrics that make it clear what that means. Water usage, resource extraction. There's a whole bunch of metrics that get gathered by different organizations in different ways. They're not consistently collected and they're not uniformly disclosed. So for an investor, it's very hard to actually analyze that when you don't have a solid footing underneath you. This is a different point than the inclusion of the I in ESG, which I think is another separately powerful point. So that's a standards comment across the board. So I mean, I haven't spoken to Mark about this specifically, but I would argue that there's a very unique window right now as these standards get set. And I should probably ask him about this, for Indigenous communities to get engaged in that conversation to ensure that they do reflect some of the particular intelligence and perspectives that Indigenous communities can bring to these issues. On a philosophical level, and this goes back a little bit to sort of some of those long-term points that we talked about, one of the strongest there's so many contributions that Indigenous knowledge should and can bring to our capital system. And I think one of the most important is the concept of the 7 generations. We've lost that completely. I mean, now we're lucky to get 7 weeks, so, that's a broader philosophical point. But that, we have lost that completely. The sense of stewardship, the sense that we owe things to the future, that there are things in this world bigger than us, that is lost. And at the risk of kind of getting too philosophical, I think this is really what the environmental, conflict or crisis puts in stark relief. And there's a lot of Indigenous knowledge that we have not listened to as settlers. And I really think it's time that we do. So that's a really broad and philosophical point. With respect to consent, a lot of this really, I think, comes down to how companies operate in their specific communities as well. So one of the really interesting examples that I was along the side, my colleagues ran this investment, is that we at OPTrust invested in a natural gas plant in northern Alberta. The deal is called Cascade. It's a $1.5 billion facility, about 900 megawatt generation natural gas. Whenever we do large, complex infrastructure investments like that, we always have many partners. And so obviously the Indigenous communities were critical to the success of this. And so we did invest alongside a coalition of 6 Indigenous communities in that plant, and work there. And they're the people on the ground every day. We're not there. We're here in Toronto, right? So they are critical to the success. And this has been, has emerged as being a really good example of how, traditional finance and Indigenous knowledge and communities can work together. Interestingly, we also got hammered for it because it's a natural gas plant and people don't want us in any fossil fuels. That's for our earlier conversation. But it's actually a really important example of when you get your S and your I right in ESG, it can actually be very impactful. So across the board, there's no standards. ESG means many, many different things. And we should all listen to the wisdom of people like Mark in our work and in our lives, because I think we have lots to learn and lots to reflect on as a society.
And the 7 generations principles for listeners, we have in another episode, we talk extensively about it with Tabitha Bull, who is the CEO of the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business. And it's such an important kind of paradigm, I think, to think of when we're thinking around ESG issues and long-term thinking, and really to the point about your previous employer, Allison, focusing capital in the long term. I think the 7 generation principle aligns a lot with that kind of concept. Allison, it has been such a pleasure chatting with you. You are such an interesting person of such diverse career experiences. I think it's come about in this interview. I've interviewed probably around 40 people on this podcast, and I think you probably have had some of the most varied career experiences. I've interviewed some people with some pretty varied career experiences to date. But I really enjoyed this conversation, which has ranged from very specific details about the kind of nature of Canadian democracy and some of the challenges facing our democratic order, to ESG standards, to divesting from fossil fuels, to the 7 generation principle, to different book recommendations, to the importance of cross-sector leadership. A really, really intriguing conversation today, Allison. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And I really look forward to keeping in touch.
Well, thank you, Scott, for having me. And also thank you so much to Latifa, who's behind the scenes, and the rest of your team for including me. Thank you so much.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our social and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture4Canada. That is Venture, the number 4, Canada, or email us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Scott Stirrett, and until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is produced by Juanita Lee Garcia and Latifa Farah. Editing and mixing also done by Latifa Farah. Erica Ormanston is our editorial assistant. Mark Wallach and Premium Beat own the copyright and publishing rights related to the song used in this podcast. The comments and opinions, recommendations, or suggestions expressed on the podcast by the guests are not liable to Venture for Canada and belong solely to each individual. Any information provided stated by our guests and our host is independent of Venture for Canada. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is a Venture for Canada brand, and all content is owned by Venture for Canada. If you'd like to use our content, please reach out to us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca.